Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 23, MBTI type and RPG growth dynamics. So welcome to our first Gorilla episode. This episode was not planned, that's why I'm putting it out on a Thursday and in between my normal Monday releases. It might be a little bit disjointed. I'm trying my best to make it cohesive with the framing that I recorded separately, but the bulk of this episode is what ended up on the cutting room floor when I was editing on Monday for episode 22 about the judging functions. It is functioning basically as a coda to our discussion of my RPG style growth alignments chart and the cognitive functions. Except this is really more about how the whole personality functions together and then where that might fit on the growth alignment chart. If you were listening very closely, or if you know type, you might have noticed that some of the columns for perceiving functions and judging functions could yield type preferences on the whole that have two different columns. So how do we know where that personality type might sit overall on our growth alignment chart? How do we know what might be their primary growth style? And, obviously, the first place to look is inside yourself, which column is resonating for you, which feels like home. Your experience of yourself is always the determinant in the end. No model can tell you who you are, and their purpose is not to tell you who you are, it's just to point you to the better questions you could be asking yourself. So, all that being said, let's get into the full type preferences versus the growth alignment chart and put this topic to bed. Before I wrap up the discussion of how the 8 functions and the Myers-Briggs personality types correlate to my RPG growth alignments chart, I do want to touch briefly on the whole personality. What happens when there is a formulation of functions where one is in one column and another's in a different column? How are they going to decide which column the whole person, their primary personality center, is? And for the functions that could go into different columns, how do you know which way they're operating? So there's a few pieces of information we're going to look at. As a quick review for how we formulate our Myers-Briggs type code, and really what underlies it is this formula of cognitive function combinations. We're going to have one judging function and one perceiving function that we prefer to all of the others. One of them will be introverted, one of them will be extroverted, and one of them will be just a little bit more dominant than the other. So the factors that I think might determine which column a person is in, if they're kind of in a split column personality situation, are going to be which function is dominant, whether you're extroverted or introverted overall as a personality type, and then as maybe a final deal breaker, your judging function will probably be just a little bit stronger than your perceiving function because it's the one that fundamentally acts. So that's kind of one set of criteria to keep in mind. Another thing to look at is which of the functions can change between your dominant and auxiliary and your judging and perceiving function. And then finally, the nature of your personal energy when you use that function. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get there. So let's unpack these criteria a little bit more. Your dominant function is the function where you have the most psychic energy. This is where you gain energy from using it, you have the highest capacity for use with it, and you probably have the most sophistication and comfort with using it. Your auxiliary function, though you do tend to have a lot of capacity and skill, is going to have the opposite orientation to your preferred function. So you have to stop and think about engaging it, and it might come a little bit less naturally, especially when you're younger, or especially if you haven't specifically worked to develop it. So all things being equal, your dominant function will probably determine your growth style column. But if you have a dominant function that can go in one of two columns, it can have, one of two growth styles, but your auxiliary is a function that really only operates in one style, that might be the determining factor. If both of your functions, your dominant and your auxiliary function, can go either way, then it might be your introversion or extroversion is the primary factor influencing the column where your personality type ends up. If you are an extroverted personality, you're probably more likely to be at one of the edges, because the controlling side is going to be what we call a pure judging energy, because your dominant function is your extroverted judging function. And on the emerging chaotic side, if you're an extroverted perceiver, an EP personality, that's going to be a pure receiving personality, where what the world sees in you is your extroverted perceiving, and that's also your dominant function. Let's use a specific example. I'll pick on my own type and my sister type, or brother type, I guess, depending on what gender it belongs to. My sibling type. There we go. Gender neutral, right? I have INTJ type preferences. So we're going to be looking at INTJ and ENTJ. Both of these personalities are going to have a preference for introverted intuiting and extroverted thinking, but the order is reversed. So for me, with INTJ preferences, that introverted intuiting is my dominant function, and extroverted thinking is my auxiliary, my second function. So both of these functions fit into different columns. The extroverted thinking is in that controlling left-hand column. Introverted intuiting, I think its true home really is in that envisioning middle column. But sometimes introverted intuiting can drift to the left a little bit. So it can show up in a controlling way. So for me, with the introverted intuiting being dominant, that envisioning space is probably going to be a little more dominant. And because I am overall an introverted personality, it means that going into the outer world to manage it is energetically costly. It's not, I don't generate energy by being in that world. So that means operating in that controlling manner is probably going to cost me energy. So unless my introverted intuiting is really in that controlling mode, most likely an INTJ is going to be in that envisioning column, even though theoretically, their TE should be in the controlling column. ENTJs, in contrast, have extroverted thinking as their dominant function and introverted intuiting as their secondary function, their auxiliary. So even if their introverted intuiting is in the envisioning mode, it's going to be subservient to the extroverted thinking, because the extroverted thinking is more dominant, and because the ENTJ is overall an extroverted personality, they're going to find operating in a managerial role with the outside world to be energizing. That's what they want to do. That's what they want to live by. So it's going to be more natural for an ENTJ to be in that controlling column rather than the envisioning, even though their introverted intuiting second function might be in that envisioning space. Let's take another example. Let's look at ENFJ and ESFJ. These are going to be our two extroverted feeling dominant personality types. An ENFJ is going to have extroverted feeling and introverted intuiting. An ESFJ is going to have extroverted feeling and introverted sensing. So for the ENFJ, their extroverted feeling is maybe a little more likely to be in the controlling column, but it can switch controlling to envisioning. Like that's the extroverted judging function that's more likely to switch to that middle column. And that introverted intuiting is more likely to be in that middle envisioning column. So unless that ENFJ has a very managing style of extroverted feeling, again, this will be the last point we talk about, like what's their personal energy, then it's more likely that an ENFJ is going to end up in that envisioning column. In contrast with an ESFJ, even though their extroverted feeling could switch columns, maybe it's in that left-hand controlling, maybe it's in that middle envisioning, their introverted sensing is going to be very solidly in the controlling left-hand column. So an ESFJ is more likely to be in that left-hand controlling mode. And for a final example, let's use ESFP. This is a type that has extroverted sensing and introverted feeling. If you'll recall, both of those tend to live in that right-hand chaotic emerging side, but both extroverted sensing and introverted feeling can present in the envisioned column in the middle instead. So for an ESFP, it could go either way. Even though extroverted sensing is their dominant, if they kind of flip-flop back and forth between using it in an envisioned way and an emerging way, but their introverted feeling is really strongly in that envisioned way, then they'd probably be envisioning. But if either the extroverted sensing is dominant function is really strongly in that emerging side, or the introverted feeling kind of goes back and forth, or maybe they both go back and forth, then they're probably a little more likely to be in that emerging chaotic edge on the right-hand side. And maybe their growth path is one that kind of takes them back and forth between those two columns, avoiding growth in one way and then the other, and then moving up into, allowing growth in one way and then the other. So I hope you can kind of see how the personality types might not be strictly confined to one column or the other, that there's going to be different presentations depending on how an individual person is using their personality and their functions. And so it's kind of like one final bonus piece of information. I just want to touch on this concept of personal energy. It's kind of like how you focus your energy. This was a concept that Dr. Dario Nardi brought up first in his Magic Diamond book, and then his most recent book, Decode Your Personality, the 64 brain-based subtypes. He gets into it more. He calls it analytic and holistic use of the functions. I'm just going to high level talk about it in terms of focus. How focused is your energy? Is it very pointed, very imposing itself upon the environment, staying very tight on the goal or what it considers to be personally important? That's going to be a more controlling energy, right? So even if you're all the way on that chaotic side with your functions, but you're using both of them in this focused way, you might push yourself to the envisioning column. I don't know that you could get all the way to that controlling column, but you might get into that middle column where you really are using them more in an envisioning way, because you're using it in this very focused, goal-directed, self-managing kind of way. But if, on the other hand, your energy is more diffuse, more receptive, more responsive, if it's not focused, if it's more malleable, then you're probably going to be likely to push toward the right, toward either that envisioning column or toward that emerging chaotic column, depending on where you started. Neither way of using your personal energy or your functions is better than the other. It's just a difference. Do you tend to be laser focused, or do you tend to be very diffuse and holistic? And that might also affect which column you end up in. One thing I found really interesting is that there weren't any types where the judging function was all the way on one column and the perceiving function was all the way on the opposite side of the chart, like where, one was on one edge and one was on the other edge. The combinations were always edge and middle, whether that was left edge and middle or right edge and middle. And I would have to think a lot longer about the about the reasons for that, other than Maybe just that certain functions have such fundamentally different ways of operating that they really couldn't work in tandem with a function that was fully on the opposite side. I don't know. Maybe I will be coming back to this at some point. To wrap all this up, I want to reiterate that we are talking about models of consciousness here. MBTI is a model. My growth alignment chart is a model. These models have correlations to each other, but there's no hard and fast rules, in part because they were independently created. They weren't designed to be used together, and also, no model can capture the fullness of a human experience or your experience of yourself. I certainly do hope that you've enjoyed this dive into type preferences. It is, again, one of my very favorite narratives and one that has been very useful for me in understanding myself and finding a sense, I guess, of centeredness and acceptance for how I tend to operate, how my mind prefers to work. And yeah, that's all for this week. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with me and to engage with these ideas. I really hope that you find value in them, and I hope that's why you keep coming back. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can find me at thepatternbreaker.com. You can follow me on Instagram at thepatternbreaker. And if you want to support the podcast and help it grow, you can check out patreon.com/narrative responsibility and see the perks that I offer to my subscribers. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?